Welcome back for day 8 of the Blender Basics Bootcamp. Today we're going to create a procedural, or generated, wood material for our trophy case using Blender's material node. So let's get to it. My name is Chris Folia, I'm your Stream Scholar. Welcome to Stream School. Alright, you made it this far, now it's time for the last big hurdle in this tutorial series. And I know that nodes can be a little bit overwhelming to wrap your head around when you're just getting started, but just bear with me, take a deep breath, put your learning cap on, and let's dive in and make this beautiful procedural wood material for our trophy case. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and select the trophy case. I'm going to hit Shift H, and that'll isolate it just like we did with the trophy cup in the last video. At this point, I also want to go ahead and brighten our world back up just because that's a nicer way to work with materials. So I'm going to go over to the worlds panel. I'm going to change the strength to maybe a value of 1. Here, I'm going to rotate out of the camera view. I'm going to zoom out. And now let's go ahead and talk about what makes a nice looking wood material. And for that, I found some nice reference on a royalty-free stock photo website called Pexels, which I'll actually link that in the description down below because I was really impressed with the quality of their images. So I'm going to take this beautiful wood cabinet reference image I found, drag it into my image editor, and let's take a look at this. So what makes a nice wood material? First of all, if we zoom in, you'll notice there's some really fine fibers or splinters of wood. Those are the parts where if you took a piece of wood, you broke it in half, and you jammed your hand into it, those would be the pointy bits that stick in your skin. But if we zoom out, we also have some nice bigger color splotches. So to make a nice, believable, convincing wood material, we're going to want to take a smaller noise texture and mix it with a nice, bigger noise texture. Then we're going to take that and use that as the basis to create all of our texture maps for our material. So let's get started. I'm going to select the trophy case, go over to the materials panel, and here I'm going to make a new material. You're also going to notice that none of our nodes are showing up if you're like me. That's because I'm panned way too far over to the left. So to fix that, I'm just going to hit A. And just like in the 3D view, I can hit period on my numpad, and that'll zoom into the selection. So here, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and I'm going to add my very first noise texture. I'm going to hit Shift A, go to Texture, and I'm going to select Noise Texture. And then, just to see what this is looking like, right off the bat, I'm going to take the factor, and I'm going to plug that into the base color. So if we zoom in, this is not even remotely, even a little bit, looking like a wood texture. But first of all, let's go ahead and change some parameters, and then we'll get there just one step at a time. So I'm going to zoom in. You're going to notice this looks pretty blurry. So to fix that, I'm going to go ahead and change the detail. Maybe a value of 6. I think looks pretty good. And this is kind of like the difference between like a low resolution JPEG and a high resolution JPEG. It's just a lot more finer detail in our noise rather than this blurry blobby mess at a detail level of 2. So I'm going to keep that at 6. And right here, I'm also going to warp this a little bit using the distortion because I think that'll make a more interesting wood material. So for the distortion, I'm going to slide that around. You'll notice that'll sort of like twist and twirl it a little bit. And I like a value of maybe 2.2. And yeah, I did kind of cheat and do this ahead of time, but I think this looks pretty cool. Honestly, right now though, it looks kind of like a weird disco trippy music video background. So to control this and actually make it look like a fine wood splinter grain, what we want to do is control it using a nice empty object, exactly like we did with our logo in the last video. So to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A, go to Input, I'm going to grab a texture coordinate node, I'm going to snap it down. Here, I'm going to use the object coordinate. And as soon as I release my mouse, you're going to notice the noise gets a whole lot smaller. Now it's more like a fine grain, but it's still kind of like a trippy hippie texture. So to fix that, I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to add an empty, and I'm going to add another cube empty. I'm going to select the trophy case. I'm going to select the eyedropper. I'm going to select the empty object. So now, nothing really changed, but if we select our empty and hit S, Shift Z, to scale on every axis except for the Z axis, we can sort of squish this noise texture down and it'll really start looking kind of like a nice wood grain or wood splinter grain of some sort. So here, I'm going to scale this up a little bit more vertically. And just like that, this is really starting to look like some wood grain. I think that looks pretty cool. The problem here is if we zoom out, it looks like a solid gray bookcase or trophy case, and that's because we need these larger color details in the wood to really sell the effect. So to get that, we're gonna make a second noise texture. So I'm gonna select the trophy case, I'm gonna select the noise texture, shift select the texture coordinate, hit Shift D Y to duplicate on the Y axis, click to set it down, and here I'm gonna grab the factor and plug that into my base color just so we can see what's going on with what will eventually be our larger grain. So immediately this looks exactly the same because we're using the exact same noise with the exact same empty object. So we need to duplicate this empty object and make it bigger. So I'm gonna select the empty, hit Shift D and X to duplicate it on the X axis just so we can differentiate the two. I'm gonna snap it down, select my trophy case, and here I'm gonna hit the X on my empty on our larger grain. You're gonna notice we get our trippy texture again. And here I'm gonna select the eyedropper and select our new empty. Everything is gonna look about the same, and that's because we need to scale this empty up. So I'm gonna take it, I'm gonna scale it, but you're gonna notice it's scaling to the 3D cursor. And that's because I forgot to change that back to the object origins in the last video. And these are the kinds of mistakes that happen all the time, and they're super easy to fix. So I'm just gonna go to the drop down, set that to the median point, and now if I scale this empty, it's gonna scale on the empty center. So I'm gonna make this about the width of our trophy case. Might even hit Alt G to recenter it. Maybe something like this. And I'm also gonna squish it down because we want some of that really nice warped detail in here. So maybe somewhere about there. You do whatever you think looks cool. Whoops, I accidentally hit Z. So here I'm gonna select the trophy case, and you're gonna notice right now, one, we only have the big noise. So we need to mix the two noises together. But two, I think this is a little bit too warped for my taste for a wood texture. So on our big grain, I'm gonna take the distortion and I'm gonna tone that down a little bit so it's a little bit more vertical. Maybe something around 0.4, I think looks pretty good. Now, to mix these two textures together, if you guessed that we're gonna use a mix RGB node, you would be correct. So I'm gonna hit Shift A, go to texture, I'm gonna grab, oh, not texture, sorry, color. I'm gonna grab a mix RGB node, I'm gonna snap it down, I'm gonna plug the large grain into slot 1, the small grain into slot 2, I'm gonna plug the mix into our base color here. So immediately, you'll notice we have some nice wood grain, and if we zoom out, we have some nice larger detail. But when I was experimenting with this earlier, and honestly, making good materials really comes down to trial and error. When I was experimenting with this earlier, I realized I liked a different blend mode better. So if I go to my mix node and I hit the drop down, we have a whole bunch of different blend modes. And I'd encourage you to experiment with these and just become familiar with what each of them do. But the one that I liked for my wood material was the overlay blend mode. That's gonna bring in more of the darkness of our noise, of our larger noise texture here. And I'm also gonna turn the factor down, maybe to like 0.3-ish, just to make the wood grain a little bit more subtle here. So that being said, this still doesn't really look like wood, and that's because it's a black and white noise texture image, and we really need to bring in all of these beautiful wood colors. So to do that, we're gonna use something called a color ramp. I'm gonna hit Shift A, go to Converter, Color Ramp, and I'm gonna snap that between my overlay and my principled shader, just like that. And nothing happens, but this is a really cool node that works pretty much just like a gradient map in Photoshop, if you're familiar with that. So what I mean by that is all of the blacks of our texture are mapped to this side of the gradient, and all of our whites in our texture are mapped to this side of the gradient. So if we slide these around, for instance, we could increase the contrast. Or we can take these little slider heads and make them whatever colors we want. So to get a really convincing wood color, I've always found the best way to do that is to literally color pick from your reference, because what better way to get a real believable color than to use a real object. So I'm gonna select the slider head, select the color box, select the eyedropper, and here I'm just gonna try to color drop some nice dark wood over here. Looks like I ended up on some of the brighter grain on our texture since this is really bright. So I'm gonna do that again to select something a little bit darker. Notice how much darker that got. And then for our light wood, I'm gonna select the whites and I'm just gonna color pick something over here. So it's already starting to look more like wood, but right now it really looks more like plastic. So I found in my experimentation that the real wood feel comes in, well, one, after we start adding roughness and bump and stuff like that, but also adding more color variation. Having just 2 colors isn't gonna create a really believable wood material. So to do this, I'm just gonna add more points to our gradient here. I'm gonna hit the plus button, can slide this over here. I can hit the eyedropper and I can just start picking all sorts of different colors until we have a whole bunch of variety in here. And I personally decided that I want to make more of a dark cherry wood kind of feel. And I couldn't find really good cherry wood cabinets on the royalty-free stock photo website that I could use commercially in a YouTube video, but what I want to do for that is just take these colors, make them a little bit darker, make them a little bit more red to give them that nice cherry wood feel. So I'm gonna make this one a bit more red, maybe even a little bit darker than the first one. And here, I'm gonna take this, make this a little bit more red, although it's actually pretty red already. Take this one, make it a little bit more red, make it a bit darker. I really like that dark hardwood feel because it just feels so classy with like a nice silver trophy on it. I'm gonna take this one, maybe move the dark ones over some just to bring that darkness in. Then I'm gonna darken all of this down, of course. And really, you could just tweak this and mess with it forever and ever and ever to find something that you really perfectly like. But this is starting to look like something that I could accept as cherry wood. So maybe with a little bit of suspension of disbelief. Anyway, this is starting to look cool. You can manipulate the colors and mess with that as much as you want to create something that you really like. A little bit brighter here. I'm such a perfectionist, but I'm gonna move on. So the next step here is gonna be to take our noise texture and give it some roughness, because right now our trophy case feels like a really shiny fake laminate. And we need to add some roughness variation to this to make it feel like real wood. So to do that, I'm gonna take our noise mixture here and we're gonna add another color ramp. So I'm gonna hit Shift A, converter, color ramp, I'm gonna snap that down, snap our mixture into it, and then rather than using this as our roughness, we're gonna do the exact same thing we've done like a billion times up until now. We're gonna use a color mix RGB node and we're gonna use some exact roughness values. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit Shift A, input value, Shift D to duplicate that, plug this one into slot 1, this one into slot 2, and plug the gradient ramp into our factor. So picture what's happening here. We have our combined wood texture made up of 2 noises plugged into a color ramp, and now the blacks and whites of this combined color ramp are going to determine what the rough portions of our surface are. So everything that's black is gonna be the first value, everything that's white is gonna be the second value. So when we convert this to a bump map, everything that's black is gonna be the stuff that's more receded, it's pushed into the surface. The stuff that's white in the texture is gonna be the stuff that's poking out for the bump map. So I think we want the crevices to be a little bit rougher. So for that, I'm gonna go ahead and change the first value to something like 0.35. Hit enter. And here I'm gonna change the second value to something a little bit shinier, maybe like a maybe like a 0.1 or 0.15 or 125. I don't know. Just mess around with it, come up with something you like. You know what? I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna turn that to 0.1 and we can always change that later. So here, I'm gonna plug our color ramp into the material output just to see what this is looking like. Now, I want this to be higher contrast for our roughness map so we can really see that detail when we plug it into our principled material. So I'm gonna take this slider and just push these 2 ends closer together, and that'll create a nice higher contrast roughness map. And I might also want this to be a more gradual gradient. So rather than using a linear blend type for the gradient, I can click the drop down and change that to a B-spline blend mode. Notice that's gonna create a much smoother gradual transition in our gradient. So we can really push this contrast and get some nice detail in there. So anyway, that's looking pretty cool. So let's see what it looks like when we plug it into the roughness. I'm gonna plug my material back into the material output. I'm gonna plug my mix shader into the roughness and check that out. We got that really nice wood detail that's catching the light, and then some of the other wood grain and detail that's sort of a little bit rougher, which I think looks really cool. So the next step here is gonna be to make the bump map, or bump. So for that, I'm gonna take my little overlay here. I'm gonna move it back here so we have more room to work with. I'm gonna hit Shift A, go to Vector, Bump, and I'm just gonna drop that onto my node graph. Here, I'm gonna take the output, plug that into the height on the bump node. Notice, zoom in here just so you can get a good view of it. Here, I'm gonna take my bump node, move it right over here next to my shader node. And what this is about to do when I plug the normal into the normal is this is gonna act like a normal map. And what that does is it tells each polygon in this model, hey, this pixel of the surface is pointing this direction. This pixel of the surface is pointing this direction. So put all of that together and you get something that behaves like it's bumpy even though it's not actually bumpy. So when the light hits it, it's hitting it from the angle that it thinks it is rather than the angle it actually is. It's really, really cool. So anyway, if I take this normal and plug it into the normal, you're gonna immediately notice that this is about the bumpiest, gnarliest, rotten, most rotten looking wood you've probably ever seen. It's just absolutely disgusting, doesn't even look like wood. And that's because our strength is way too high. And when I say way too high, I mean like way too high. We're gonna take this one value and turn it all the way down to like a 0.025. That low, not even 0.1. Now when I hit enter, you're gonna notice this looks a whole lot more like wood and it's starting to get a whole lot more convincing. Look at that. Now, finally, one other thing we might wanna do is go to our camera view, look at this, and I'm starting to realize that this is a little bit too shiny. And rather than messing with the roughness, I'm just gonna turn the highlight value down. So for that, I'm gonna go to the specular, and if you slide that all the way to the left, you get no reflectivity. If you slide it all the way to the right, you get maximum reflectivity. So I'm gonna set this at about half the value it was, maybe like 0.25. And I think that looks a little bit better and a lot less shiny, which is kind of nice. So that being said, we've sort of finished the vertical portion of our wood. I'm pretty happy with it, at least for now. But you're gonna notice our shelves are still like a splotchy disco kind of pattern. We need to make this a nice horizontal wood material. So for that, we're gonna create a second material, but rather than duplicating this entire node network or redoing any work, we're gonna create something called a node group. And to do that, I'm gonna click and drag to select everything between the texture coordinate and the material output. It's like a big old vertical node sandwich, I guess. I'm gonna hit Control G to group these nodes, and you're gonna notice the background turns green. So if I hit Tab, I can go out of our new group, and you're gonna notice this entire wood material network is now its own node. And the really cool thing about working this way is we can now take this node or node group and plug it into any material we want. And if we make any changes to the group, it's automatically gonna change it across every single one of those materials. How cool is that? So anyway, I'm gonna take the node group, hit in, and let's organize this a little better. First of all, we probably wanna name this to something that's recognizable, because if we open this file like 5 years down the line, we're not gonna know what's going on. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop down the properties here, and I'm gonna call this wood material group. I think that's pretty descriptive. You can honestly name it whatever you want though. You could name it Larry if you really wanted to. Then you're also gonna notice that our inputs into the group aren't labeled, but they're also crisscrossing, and that's not super clean. So we could just drag these opposite of each other, but what we can do instead is hit Tab to go into the node group, select the group input, go up to the node tab over here, select the top vector input, and hit this little down arrow. I know that was a whole lot of steps, but now you're gonna notice that these are no longer tangled. We also probably wanna label these, so again, if we come back to this later and decide we wanna use it, we can just plug, we know what we're supposed to plug into these individual slots. Just saying vector isn't particularly descriptive. So I'm gonna double click the bottom one here, and I'm gonna call this small grain. Then I'm gonna double click the top one. I'm gonna call this large grain. Finally, I'm gonna hit tab to go out of the group. And now we're gonna give a brand new material to our shelves. So if I go over to our material editor, I'm gonna hit plus to create a new material slot. I'm gonna hit tab to go into edit mode. And remember, this entire trophy case is created with just a couple modifiers. So we only have to modify half of one little cubby hole, and it's gonna spread those changes across our entire trophy case, which is really cool. So I'm gonna hit Alt-A to deselect everything, hover my mouse over the top shelf, hit L to select it, hover my mouse over the bottom shelf, hit L to select that. Then I'm gonna hit assign on our brand new material slot. Here, I'm gonna hit tab to go back to object mode, and I'm gonna go ahead and rename my wood texture just before I forget, and now's a pretty convenient time to do it. I'm gonna call this wood vertical. Then I'm gonna select our empty slot for our shelves. I'm gonna select the material dropdown. I'm gonna choose wood vertical, and we're gonna make this a single user material. So to do that, I'm gonna click the little 2 right here. I'm gonna name this wood horizontal. So we have our node group, and we have our inputs to the node group in our wood horizontal. So all we have to do is change out which empties we're using. And then we'll have horizontal wood and we'll have vertical wood. So for that, I'm gonna select both of these empties right here, both of our wood empties. I'm gonna hit Shift D. I'm gonna right click to drop them back down right where they were. I'm gonna hit RY90 on my keyboard, hit enter to set it in place. And now all we have to do is go back to our trophy, hit X on both of these eyedropper inputs. You're gonna notice we're back to our tippy dippy trippy texture here. But to fix that, now all I have to do is choose these eyedroppers. So for our small grain, I'm gonna choose the new small empty. And for our large grain, I'm going to choose the large empty. And immediately you'll notice we have our nice horizontal wood texture. And like I said, we have 2 separate wood materials here, but they're both being controlled by the same node group. So if I come into this node group, and let's say I want to change the color of this, maybe from my camera perspective. Let's say we want to make it darker or something. I could hit Shift A, color, RGB curves, and I could snap that down in between my color ramp and my principled. And now this is just like a curves modifier in Photoshop, for instance. So for this, I could just drag it up to make it brighter, or drag it down to make it nice, darker, and classier, if I do say so myself. And you're gonna notice it's changing both our horizontal shelves and our vertical portions of the trophy case at the exact same time, because both of these individual materials are using the same node group. There's so much power involved with that. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and hit tab to go out of the node group. I'm gonna hit Alt-H to unhide everything in the scene. I'm gonna go back over to my world panel, set the strength maybe even darker than it was before, maybe like 0.115. I think that's looking pretty cool. And at this point, I just want to make some final visual tweaks to our scene, because we've done most of the grunt work. We've done all of the hard parts. So first of all, I want some nice visual shadows on this trophy case. Because it's so dark, our light's not really having much of an effect in terms of creating shadows. So we just need to brighten up our light a little bit. So I'm gonna rotate out of my camera. I'm gonna select my key light, hit 0 to go back to my camera. And here I'm gonna go to my light tab. I'm gonna change that to way brighter, just so it has a bigger visual impact. Maybe something like 3250. Hit enter, and now you can see that we actually have like some nice color visible on our trophy case, and we get some nice shadows in here, and it just looks a whole lot nicer in my opinion. But you can also experiment with whatever you want to make it as well. Another thing we might want to do is make the reflections a little bit less bright. Now that they're on a almost solid black backdrop here, the reflections are a little bit too prevalent. So I'm going to select the glass, go to my material over here. I'm going to change that to 0.015 instead of 0.025, and I think that looks a lot nicer. One other thing that's bothering me here is the text. And again, these are all just final tweaks that I decided I want to start making to the scene just to finish this up. So I'm going to hit S to scale my text down, because I think it's a little bit too big relative to the nameplate. Then I'm going to hit G, Y, to move it on its own local Y-axis, all stuff we've done before. Click to set that down. And finally, I think it's way brighter than anything else in the scene. So I'm just going to turn the color of my text down a little bit as well, just to make it a little bit dimmer. Hit Alt-A to deselect it, and I think this is looking pretty cool. Oh, one other thing we want to change, I knew there was one other thing, is you can see the reflection of our fill light, just this really hard-edged perfect square in the upper right-hand corner of the frame. So to fix that, I'm literally just gonna move my fill light. So I'm gonna select the fill light we made a couple videos ago, hit GZ, and I'm gonna move it up outside of the camera view. Click to set it down, and now I'm gonna hit the little, oh, before I move it to that, one other way you can check the composition of your image for your camera image is you can select your camera, you can go to your camera settings, and if you go to viewport display, where it says passive hard out, if you set that to 1, that's gonna make everything outside of your camera solid black. Now I'm gonna hit this little chain link icon to hide all of the outlines and stuff that doesn't render, and we can take a really good look at our trophy before we move on to the last two parts here. I think this is looking really cool. Pat yourself on the back, you've made it through all of the hard parts now. Let's just move on and finish up this tutorial series. I'll see you in the next video. At this point, you should have a decent looking wood material for your trophy case and hopefully a pretty decent understanding of material nodes and object-based coordinates in Blender. That's a mouthful. If you found this video useful and want to stay tuned for day 9, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and ring the bell. I'll be releasing ththese basics videos on a daily basis for the duration of the course. And if you want to come hang out with me live, I'm live at least every Friday at youtube.com/oraclefish. Also, if you want to download my example files or just support what I do here on the channel, make sure you check out my brand new Patreon, link in the description. Until next time, my name is Chris Folia, I'm your stream scholar, and class is out.